I have an exciting episode for you today on the Fancy Scientist podcast. I have been thinking about creating this episode, honestly, for years. We are talking about de-extinction. This is the concept of bringing back an extinct species to life. The reason why I created this episode as soon as I could is because you've probably seen the headlines that the dire wolf is no longer extinct, that a company claims it has brought it back from the dead, and there are 3 living dire wolves right now. I've been getting so many questions about this. So I'm going to get into the science of what is going on. Are these really dire wolves? The headlines this week for me have actually been flooded more with scientists saying, not so fast, these are not dire wolves. But more importantly, we're going to get into the larger conversation about de-extinction. What it is, why people are doing it, should we be doing it? I'm going to talk about the conservation applications as well as moral and ethical considerations. There is so much to talk about in this episode. So let's just get started. Before we begin, I want to say that I am a legit scientist. My name is Fancy Scientist because I am a scientist. I've been working as a scientist, and I actually got my Ph.D. doing genetic work. I use non-invasive genetics to study African forest elephants. So this is really in my wheelhouse. I will say that genetic research moves incredibly fast. So I am no longer up to date with the technology, but when I was in graduate school, we had lots of discussions about de-extinction. And I for sure can weigh in on the conservation and ecological implications of de-extinction. I also want to say that I did my very best to provide a very nuanced discussion, bringing up all sides of this issue. I will share with you my personal opinions, but in light of what I talked about in the last podcast on effective communication, I really wanted to bring up all different sides, and I did my research. You're going to find out that these dire wolves are from a research team at a company called Colossal Biosciences. I listened to 2 interviews with CEO Ben Lamb. One of them was Joe Rogan. It was an incredibly long interview. It was 3 hours long, my first time listening to Joe Rogan, so that was interesting. And then I also listened to an interview with George Church, who is the co-founder of Colossal Biosciences. He is a legit and well-known geneticist at Harvard University and MIT. It doesn't seem like he interviews that much. His interview was from several years ago. It didn't really talk about de-extinction that much. I wanted to really cover all different sides of the story. I will let you know where I fall in and where other scientists fall in, but I wanted to give a full overview of what is going on right now. First, let's talk about what de-extinction means in general. Extinct means that a species is no longer living at all on this planet. There are no living individuals. Extinct animals would be obviously the dinosaurs, but also more recent animals like the passenger pigeon, the dodo, or the thylacine, also called the Tasmanian tiger, and then also the animals that we're talking about today, dire wolves, which come from the Pleistocene. So the de-extinction process, you are bringing a species back to life that has completely died out. Let's talk about how de-extinction theoretically works. You would have found DNA somehow. This would come from bone, maybe a hair sample, and then use the DNA to bring the species back to life. And there are some barriers to that. I'm going to refer to a Carl Zimmer New York Times article throughout this podcast, and I'm going to read this synopsis about ways that you can do this. Carl Zimmer writes, over the years, scientists have proposed various ways of reviving a lost species. Suppose, for example, that they recovered an intact cell from the frozen carcass of a woolly mammoth. Perhaps the cell could be thawed and used to create a mammoth clone. This is really hard, and the reason why the de-extinction process is so hard is because DNA degrades rapidly over time. I used non-invasive DNA from African forest elephants, which are a living species. Even though the DNA came from a living species, because the DNA was not a high quality source, we did it non-invasively, which means that we didn't want to capture the animals because this can cause a lot of stress to the animals. It's also really expensive, really difficult to do. So we use dung. The idea behind this is when elephants poop, they slough off cells. When I was collecting these samples, though, I had to make sure the dung samples were really fresh within 24 hours. Even if they were really fresh, and you could tell how fresh they were by the smell, and then also there's a sheen. It's kind of gross, but it's really cool. And they quickly degrade over time, and the DNA degrades over time. Even within these samples that were really fresh, it could actually be really difficult, and a lot of my samples didn't work. I wasn't able to successfully amplify DNA from the dung samples that I collected. So blood and tissue are really the best sources from DNA, but you can also get it from hair and the follicle part that is attached to the skin. You can get it from tissue, and you can get DNA from bone or teeth. The best sources, though, are blood and tissue. When we think about fossilized specimens, if we're going back really far in time, like dinosaurs, when you have dinosaur bones, the bones are actually replaced by rocks. You're not able to even get DNA. This is why doing something like Jurassic Park would be incredibly difficult to do because it's so far back in time that the DNA is so degraded. But when we're talking about Pleistocene animals, so animals that only went extinct thousands to tens of thousands of years ago, there are some good specimens. And this has to do with the way that these animals died and the conditions that they died in. What keeps DNA preserved is cold environments. Actually, in the lab that I worked in, we would store DNA in freezers. So during the ice age, the conditions were cold. There was ice all over the place. So if an animal died and it remained frozen, you could get really good samples. And scientists are finding really good samples of mammoths and other animals in the more northern regions of the world because it's still cold there. A lot of these specimens are found in the permafrost where the ice has not thawed, and there are skin and hair samples of mammoths. But still, even with these good specimens, the DNA degrades over time. When we were talking about de-extinction in graduate school, the concept that we learned is that you would have a lot of ancient DNA, but it would still be degraded. And the concept that we learned was to use the next most closely related living animal to fill in the gaps. For the woolly mammoth, that would be the Asian elephant. And actually, woolly mammoths are more closely related to Asian elephants than the existing living African elephants are to Asian elephants. So you would look at the ancient DNA of a woolly mammoth, and for the parts that you were missing, you would fill in those segments with Asian elephant DNA. Then you would take the embryo that you create, implant it in an Asian elephant, and get the Asian elephant to deliver your woolly mammoth baby. The genetic technology of filling those gaps was not there at the time when I was in graduate school. I'm not up to date on the technology now. But another problem was that it would be difficult to get an Asian elephant to successfully carry a woolly mammoth embryo to term. I'm also not up to date with captive breeding in elephants, but when I was in graduate school, I graduated in 2012. It was really difficult to get living elephant species to breed in captivity, just in general. Scientists were not sure like what the problems were, but it was really just difficult for them to breed, just regular elephants. So imagine if you have this woolly mammoth embryo inside of a female elephant, they already have a difficult time breeding in captivity, and now they have a different species inside them. It's going to be very challenging to get this to work. There's going to be a high rate of the female aborting the fetus. In graduate school, we would really focus on two species for de-extinction. The woolly mammoth was one that people were really interested in, and the other one was the Tasmanian tiger or the thylacine. The thylacine went extinct more recently, only over 100 years ago in the 1930s. And the thylacine, scientists do have preserved specimens. To my knowledge, they are not frozen. They are in formaldehyde or alcohol. And I don't remember the specifics, but I do remember us talking about how difficult it would be to bring back the thylacine, that it just wouldn't seem likely. The DNA is not high quality enough. Now, the thylacine might seem easier to actually impregnate with another Australian marsupial. Now, according to Ben Lamb on the Joe Rogan podcast, he said that the closest living relative to the Tasmanian tiger was a species of Dunnart, which is a marsupial in Australia. But just doing a quick Google search, and at the time when I was in graduate school, it was the Tasmanian devil. I'm not sure what the latest research says, but even so, those are really different looking animals from the Tasmanian tiger, the thylacine. But marsupials, most of their reproduction happens outside of the womb. They have a pouch, and that is where the very small baby develops. Whereas in placental mammals, most of the development takes place internally in the mother's womb. So if you think about human babies, you have the human baby growing in. If you think about elephants, you have the elephant growing inside the mother for 2 years. Yes, it has a 2-year pregnancy. And then the elephant is born as a baby, able to walk, able to interact with other elephants. Whereas marsupials, they give birth to a very teeny tiny baby that really cannot function outside of the pouch. Most of the development takes place in the pouch until they get old enough that they can walk, move around, interact with other individuals. I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% sure why the thylacine is so difficult, because even given the huge differences between Tasmanian devils or Dunnarts compared to the thylacine, most of the development happens outside the body, so it does seem like it would be easier to happen. Let's talk about what is going on today with the dire wolves and what the company Colossal Biosciences did to quote unquote resurrect this species. I'm going to read from the Carl Zimmer article. The entrepreneurs and scientists who started Colossal in 2021 took a different path. They would analyze ancient DNA to identify the key mutations that made extinct species distinct from living relatives. The researchers would then engineer the DNA of a living relative and use those genes to produce viable animals. The revived animals would not be genetically identical to the extinct species, but they would be identical in crucial ways. For one, while it is relatively easy to make a single edit to the DNA of an animal, the scientists hoped to make dozens of edits. Then there was the matter of producing animals from the edited DNA. The researchers at Colossal envisioned growing mammoth fetuses and Asian elephant surrogate mothers, but no one had ever carried out in vitro fertilization with elephants. To resurrect a dodo, they would somehow have to maneuver a modified bird embryo into a hard-shelled egg. Given the challenges with animals like the dodo, where they talk about the egg, and then also the Asian elephants, where they're already having a hard time reproducing in captivity, the reason why I think that the Colossal team switched to dire wolves and this approach with the gene editing is because it was easier. My hypothesis is backed up by the New York Times article. Carl Zimmer writes, in 2023, the Colossal team began to focus on dire wolves as a potentially easier target species. Dire wolves are related to dogs, so scientists could take advantage of years of research on cloning dogs and implanting dog embryos. Dr. Shapiro, who joined Colossal in 2024, was part of the team that first retrieved dire wolf DNA from fossils in 2021. But that work recovered only traces of genetic material. At Colossal, she and her colleagues decided to search for more dire wolf DNA, hoping to better understand the biology of the extinct species and perhaps revive the animal. It was the simplest path to get a predictable result, Dr. Shapiro said. With a list of dire wolf genes in hand, the scientists at Colossal started their de-extinction project. First, they isolated cells from the blood of gray wolves and grew them in a dish. There, they tinkered with the wolf DNA. 10 years ago, scientists altered a single gene in beagles to give them big muscles. Since then, the researchers have learned how to edit several genes at once in mammal DNA. For the direwolf project, the Colossal team set out to edit 20 genes, pushing the technology to its current limit. The scientists introduced direwolf mutations to 15 genes, but they did not introduce the remaining 5 because previous studies had shown that those 5 mutations caused deafness and blindness in gray wolves. In contrast, what the Colossal team is, they're starting with the wolf DNA and then they're making edits to make it direwolf-like. There is some disagreement between scientists and the team at Colossal about which animal is most closely related to the direwolf. Scientists are saying that it's African jackals, whereas this Colossal team is saying gray wolves. And I am not up to date on this research, but from my understanding, listening to Ben Lamb talk on the Joe Rogan podcast, he is saying that they have a higher quality sample of direwolf DNA, and then that the jackal study is out of date, essentially. I don't think this research has been published. There's a preprint of it, but this has not gone through the peer review process. When peer review is when other scientists review your work. How science works, I'm going to link to a podcast about how the research process works. How science works is it's like a series of checks and balances. You can't just say whatever you want. And in the Joe Rogan podcast, Ben Lamb also kind of like poo-poos the system of publications. He's like, oh, well, if we did all these publications, we would never get any work done. Scientists are too busy publishing. And he talks about how it's based on egos and grants. The publication process is critical for science because that is how scientists communicate. You write up what you have done. You write up the whole research process, all of your methods, and you do it in a way that it can be replicated. And again, this is a way for scientists to check each other. Then you submit it to a journal. Other scientists review your work. They provide critiques and feedback. And you, as the person who have created the paper, have the opportunity to listen to the feedback and incorporate it and revise your study, or say, no, they're wrong, but you need to back it up. And then the editor makes decisions. This is how science happens. You can't just say whatever you want. And it seems that they kind of are just saying that whatever they want, or at least before the paper is out, they're saying, hey, they're more closely related to gray wolves, so just trust us on this. Direwolves and gray wolves are more than 99% genetically identical, Dr. Mecken and her colleagues found. 80 genes were dramatically distinct. Some are known to influence the size of living dogs and wolves, suggesting they were responsible for the big bodies of direwolves. So this is where scientists are having a problem. One, they are not convinced that gray wolves are the closest relatives to direwolves. And they're not convinced that they're 99% genetically similar. Even if they are 99% genetically similar, I'm not confident that the dissimilarities rely in those edits that they made on those genes. Here they're saying that there are 80 genes dramatically distinct, but they only edited 20 genes. So 20 out of 80, only 1/4. Is this enough gene editing to be a direwolf? Scientists don't think so, and I agree with them. Scientists, including myself, don't think that these gene edits represent enough of the diversity. To compare, human beings and chimpanzees are roughly 99% similar too. I'm going to read you this statement from the American Museum of Natural History. We're 98.8% the same, but if human and chimp DNA is 98.8% the same, why are we so different? Because numbers tell a different story. Each human contains roughly 3 billion base pairs, or bits of information. Just 1.2% of that equals about 35 million differences. So if you took a chimpanzee and made edits on 20 genes, do you think you would get a human? I will leave that for you to ponder, and then you can decide if this is a direwolf. But from what I'm hearing from scientists is that scientists are not convinced Let me read you this statement. Adam Boyko, a geneticist at Cornell University who is not involved in the project, said, "It's exciting that we can make functional versions of extinct species," but he did not consider Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi to be truly resurrected direwolves. I listened to a podcast from my friend Andrew Lewin, who does the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, and he featured the conservation geneticist at the Toronto Zoo. And she was talking about how these multiple gene edits are really cool to do this all at the same time. So there is scientific merit, there is scientific discovery here, but do we have a dire wolf? I don't think so. Other scientists don't think so either. The reason why I think that Colossal took this approach is because they are a company. Listening to the Joe Rogan podcast, he is not a scientist and he admits this, and that's okay. He's an entrepreneur. That is also okay. And he started this company to do this, but they have investors, they have funders, and science can be really slow. This is a really ambitious thing that they're doing. And what I think happened is they wanted to have some sort of result. So they took this approach to get some press, to get some good media, to get the investors excited. And if you listen to Dr. Shapiro's quote, "It was the simplest path to get a predictable result." That seems to echo my sentiment. Even before I read that statement, this is what I was thinking. Some of Colossal's investors are actually well-known people. And on the Joe Rogan podcast, he talks about Chris Hemsworth. He talks about Peter Jackson, the director of Lord of the Rings. And I believe he mentions George R.R. Martin, who is a co-author on the preprint of the study that I was talking about. So I'm probably right that he is a funder. This in itself is not ethical because in order to be a co-author on a peer-reviewed publication, you actually have to be involved in the research in some aspect. But that is for another podcast episode. Another reason why I think they chose direwolves is because not only of the dog research, but direwolves became super popular after Game of Thrones. You can tell one of the direwolves is named after Khaleesi. As a big Game of Thrones fan, I am disappointed she was not named Arya because Khaleesi did not have a direwolf. So it doesn't make sense, but whatever, I will give them that. Because the de-extinction process is so difficult with these other species, I think the company needed a win. They needed a win for investors. They need to show that they're doing work, that their money is being put to good use, it's doing cool things, which is fine. I totally understand that, and that's okay to do. But where the company went wrong is by exaggerating the truth and saying this was a dire wolf. Rather, this is about resurrecting ancient genes rather than a whole species. And in fact, the interview I listened to with CEO Ben Lamb that was taken in August, this is actually what he says in the beginning. He says they're resurrecting ancient genes. But in the Joe Rogan interview, he was saying straight up, these are dire wolves. Let's go more into why this isn't a dire wolf. As you've seen, there is likely a lot of genetic information from the dire wolf missing from these gray wolves that have had dire wolf genes inserted into them. I shared with you that quote from the American Museum of Natural History that the 1.2% difference between humans and chimps represents 35 million differences. In a nutshell, they're oversimplifying. And it seems like that they are selecting for what they think a dire wolf will be like, which listening to the interview seems to be based on morphology. It seems like they're really focusing on differences that would be expressed in their appearance, but there might be things that are not as obvious or that we don't know to look for that make the dire wolf the dire wolf. And Ben Lamb even alludes to this himself when he on the Joe Rogan podcast interview. He talks about resurrecting an ancient species. He says it's like buying a jigsaw puzzle from a garage sale. You don't know all of the pieces in it. There's going to be pieces missing. We're making this metaphor in relation to ancient DNA, so we're going to be missing some pieces. And then he also says it's like you don't even have the picture on the box, so you don't know what you're making. So if you don't fully know what you're making, how do you know that the edits that you have made represent what you are making? One of the arguments that Ben uses to call these dire wolves is that scientists have a lot of ambiguity about species concepts. And hearing him on the Joe Rogan podcast, it sounds like he thinks that scientists don't agree on what a species is. There is a multitude of species concepts. From grad school, I remember there's at least 20. The scientists do have arguments about what designates a species, but there is more consensus than Ben Lamb is giving weight to. We do agree that for species that reproduce through sexual means, that mating and having viable offspring is a criteria. Now, of course, there are species that can interbreed and have viable offspring that we can consider a separate species. For example, dogs, wolves, and coyotes, they can all interbreed with each other, but we talk about them being different species. But it's also about like how the species behave. If given the option, a wolf will mate with a wolf, a coyote will mate with a coyote. So this helps reinforce different species. When you get to species that do not reproduce sexually, then this can get more difficult and more species concepts and other species concepts have been used. And with the advancement of genetics, we're also using genetic species concepts. In the past, scientists had to rely on morphological differences a lot because that's what we could see. But when we start looking at the genetics, animals that look really similar can actually be really genetically different. And if it's really difficult to observe their behavior, for example, maybe there's like different frog species that look the same and it's difficult to observe their behavior, you can tell cryptic species apart by looking at their genetics. So there are different definitions, but for vertebrate species, scientists really do use the mating concept a lot. And there's even some controversy around the red wolves about whether they are actually a separate species because their lineage is full of coyote and gray wolf DNA, and people suggest that they're actually the result of hybridization events from these species. The Joe Rogan interview, Ben was kind of saying that like, oh, like all species are mixed up. Like coyotes, gray wolves, dogs are like all mixed up. Like they all have each other's genes. This is true. Coyotes will have dog and gray wolf genes, but a coyote is still mostly a coyote. So I do feel like Ben is being a little bit too liberal with using the ambiguities that rely within species concepts and the genetic admixture within species to say that these are dire wolves, because the majority of the DNA is actually gray wolf DNA. What I'm wondering is if the sample that they had for this study to compare dire wolves to gray wolves, if this sample was so good, why were they not able to use that as the basis for these pups rather than relying on gray wolves? Another reason why this falls short of being a resurrected species, and this was my argument that I always had in graduate school and why I was against de-extinction, although I'm not against de-extinction for certain species. There's a lot more that goes into an animal than just its genetics. Even before we get into that, within its genetics, you have epigenetics. And epigenetics are basically differences in the ways that genes express themselves. Once you are a living individual, the environment interacts with your genes and it can turn certain genes on or off. For example, I remember in graduate school learning about in mouse studies, if the mother did not lick the pups, then the pups would be affected negatively in some sort of way. There is an environmental impact that can affect our genes as well, and whether they are turned on and having a downstream physiological effect. If the dire wolf or woolly mammoth or whatever species we bring back is not in the same environment, then it's not going to have those environmental factors and it's going to behave differently. And the environment consists of not just the habitat that it's in. And for the dire wolf, this habitat is going to be totally different. The ice age looks very different ecologically from planet Earth today. A lot of the species that existed at that time are now extinct. A lot of its prey species are extinct, but also the other individuals. What is this dire wolf being raised by? Is it being raised by dogs? I don't know. Or is it being raised by human beings in captivity? It's not going to have that mother's care. And then, even aside from the epigenetic effects, with mammals especially, so much knowledge is passed down from the mother to the offspring, and there's a lot of learned behavior. Say you were able to successfully bring back a woolly mammoth and even have the embryo implanted in an Asian elephant. If an Asian elephant is raising this woolly mammoth calf, is it actually going to behave like a woolly mammoth? No, it's going to behave like an Asian elephant. So there's more that goes into a species than just having the DNA. Adam Boyko, the geneticist I quoted earlier, goes on to say in the New York Times article, they are not being raised in direwolf packs where they could learn direwolf behavior. And they aren't eating an ancient diet, so they are not acquiring their ancestors' unique suite of intestinal microbes. And we're learning so much about the microbiome and how this influences the physiology of a species. So things are just going to be really different for these dire wolves. Even if you did have really great ancient DNA and you were able to bring back what scientists would consider to be a genetically pure dire wolf, you're still going to have these differences that are going to make it not have dire wolf behavior. We're really not going to be able to learn about dire wolves from these species because they're going to act totally different when they don't have other dire wolves around and they're in a completely different environment. Before we get into the next topic, I want to thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this, please share it with somebody. I would also greatly appreciate if you could rate and review my podcast wherever you listen to it. This really helps other people find it and spread the message about science, wildlife, and conservation. Let's take a minute to talk about why do this. Why should we bring back extinct species? A lot of scientists are against this. I am not 100% against this. It depends on the species. For Colossal Biosciences, listening to the interviews, it seems like they want to do this just because it's cool, honestly. And I admit, this is cool. So many people are fascinated by this. If you had a living woolly mammoth, that would be really groundbreaking, really fascinating. And Ben Lamb talks in the Joe Rogan interview about how him and co-founder George Church basically this company was initiated from a conversation with George Church that George Church meant he wanted to bring back the woolly mammoth. And Ben seemed fascinated by this. He kind of hounded George Church to make this happen. And he is an entrepreneur, so he set up the investors and the company to make things happen. The other reason why you'd want to bring back extinct species is to fulfill ecological niches and for conservation. Now, Ben Lamb goes into some of this in the Joe Rogan podcast, but to be honest, it seems like an afterthought. And given the lack of depth on conservation and ecological issues, it doesn't seem this is where their area of focus is. It kind of reminds me of greenwashing, where a company is saying that they're doing something good for the environment, but really it's outweighed by the negative consequences. Animals have impact on the environment and they fulfill ecological niches. With the dire wolves, they would be apex predators. But here in the United States, we already have apex predators. We already have gray wolves. We have mountain lions. So for me, it doesn't make sense to use that ecological argument for dire wolves because they are not replacing a niche that doesn't already exist. And scientists have successfully reintroduced gray wolves into areas throughout the United States. In fact, Ben talks about that a lot on the Joe Rogan podcast. It's really interesting because they talk about how you can't just release gray wolves anywhere, that people will shoot them, that ranchers won't tolerate them if you do this. But they also seem to lend to the possibility that dire wolves would be released on the landscape and that they should be released on the landscape. So it's really interesting that they acknowledge that this is really difficult for gray wolves, but gloss over this for dire wolves, which would seem to be even harder than gray wolves given that they're larger. And although gray wolves do not mainly prey upon livestock, they do occasionally take livestock. So dire wolves are going to be likely to do the same. In the case of the woolly mammoth, there are advantages to having large herbivores on the landscape. African elephants, they help with a lot of fertilization of the soil by eating vegetation and defecating. They have carbon impacts because of their heavy weight, are able to help keep soil in place. This has carbon impacts. I'm going to link up to a WWF article where it's estimated that one forest elephant can increase the net carbon capture capacity of the forest by almost 250 acres. This is equivalent to removing from the atmosphere a year's worth of emissions from over 2,000 cars. Again, the problem with African elephants is this human wildlife conflict aspect where people have a hard time tolerating the elephants because they raid crops, it creates conflict, we're losing habitat. Although woolly mammoths would go in a different area, they would go in northern Asia. It's unclear if people on the landscape would tolerate them. Ben Lamb does talk about involving local communities, but his approach is not really transparent. It's at least from the podcast, I'm not really sure what he's doing to get local communities to accept woolly mammoths. Here in the United States, we do have herbivores that can restore these ecosystem processes like bison. So rather than bringing these extinct species back, I think that we should focus on the restoration efforts with the animals that we already have in existence, like the gray wolf and the bison, as well as expand conservation efforts for the African and Asian elephants in those continents. When it comes to the thylacine, I actually do think bringing this species back is a good idea because the thylacine went extinct more recently in the 1930s. And a thylacine is an apex predator in Australia. It's an apex marsupial predator. So, with the loss of the thylacine, it really disrupted the interactions between the different mammal species in Australia. And bringing the thylacine back would be like the restoration efforts we've had with gray wolves here in the United States. I actually think bringing the thylacine back is okay. And I think it would be really, obviously, a cool thing to do. It would have important ecological applications in Australia. Australia also has a ton of invasive mammals that are decimating their local marsupial populations, specifically domestic cats and foxes. So bringing the thylacine back, I assume that they would eat those species. Again, I don't think it would be 100% like a thylacine for the behavioral reasons and the epigenetic reasons that I mentioned before, as well as some of the environmental reasons. However, Australia has not changed that much in 100 plus years as the dire wolf's environment has changed given the tens of thousands of years of evolution. For sure went extinct due to human intervention, whereas the dire wolf, we're not sure. But rather, the more important reasons I think that this species is okay to bring back is that it more recently went extinct and it serves this more important ecological role. Going back to why we should do this, like, is it okay to do this just because it's cool? When I was in graduate school, I really was against de-extinction for most species, except for the thylacine. I was on board with that. One of Ben Lamb's arguments too is that when you're doing this kind of research, that you just don't know the implications. You're doing advanced scientific research. There could be applications to humans. There could be advancements made that you just don't know what the applications are now. This could be analogous to exploring space. Why not explore Earth? Why do we need to explore space? There's really no practical reason to exploring space. It's all about discovery. It's all about just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And that is okay. So maybe scientists should be more open to this, that this is something cool to do and that it pushes science to the limit. There is that argument, but I will leave it up to you to decide what you think. The last thing to consider with de-extinction is this morally wrong? Is this ethically wrong? Should we be bringing back an animal, especially when it comes to animals like the woolly mammoth? Elephants are amongst the most intelligent animals on Earth. They are incredibly socially complex. They're even thought to have emotions. Is it fair to the animal to bring back a species like this that has been extinct? These are some of the questions that come along with de-extinction. In the Joe Rogan podcast, him and Ben talk a lot about the philosophical implications of this. Should we, quote unquote, be playing God? Ben thinks we already are playing God because we've domesticated animals. We've done that by artificially selecting for traits. I'm going to leave you to your opinion. I personally think that although this would be super cool to science, that I don't ultimately think it is right or really purposeful to bring back a species that has gone extinct for a long period of time, more than 100 years. I don't think it makes sense given that the environment has changed so much. Yes, there would be science and technological advancements, but ultimately, you're never going to get the animal that went extinct in the first place. It's always going to be different. Does de-extinction help conservation? Does it hurt conservation? Let's go over this question. Some people argue, including Ben Lamb, that de-extinction helps conservation. The argument is that the scientific advancements in making de-extinction possible could be applied to conservation. If a species was having a difficult time reproducing, then you could bring the same type of genetic methods to clone individuals or to tweak genetic diversity so that more individuals could be released on the landscape. For example, there are some species where we're only down to like dozens of individuals. And Ben Lamb on the podcast talks about the red wolf. But what Ben is failing to recognize is that for a majority of the species, the conservation problems do not lie within the species biology, meaning that as long as the animals have enough habitat and enough individuals to breed with, they will persist and do really well. Genetic inbreeding is a risk for some species that have really small population sizes, but for most species, even if the population is pretty small, they can recover. Talking about the red wolf, the real problem with the red wolf is that people are not tolerating the species like the gray wolves. They are shooting it because they don't want wolves around or unintentionally because they think it's a coyote. Red wolves are also dying from being hit by cars. But another big factor in red wolf conservation is that they hybridize with coyotes. In fact, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to go into dens and actually euthanize pups where the parents, one is a red wolf and one is a coyote, because they don't want the hybrids diluting the gene pool. Where these genetic efforts could help out red wolves is by producing more red wolf individuals in the population. Therefore, this would increase the chances that a red wolf would mate with another red wolf and not a coyote. When given the choice, red wolves will mate with other red wolves and not with coyotes. So this would decrease the chance of hybridization. And this is kind of what Ben argues that they could do, that they could create like these artificial wombs and just clone red wolves and release them. But again, what he's failing to recognize is that the public has to tolerate this species on their land. Even for animals where reproduction does seem like it is a challenge, for example, in the Sumatran rhino, the challenge is confounded often with politics and people. So in the case of the Sumatran rhino, there are living individuals in captivity. There's no living individuals in the wild. But it's difficult to get them to reproduce because each country wants their own population of Sumatran rhino to kind of brag about. If you could put them all in one facility to get them to reproduce, this would increase genetic diversity and this would increase the population size. That being said, I do think the genetic innovations from this technology could be applied to species like the Sumatran rhino and other species where the number of individuals is really small. But this would only work provided if the individuals have the habitat to be released to, and if the people who are going to live with those animals will tolerate them. We often think about conservation being studying the animals, but so much of it involves people. Actually, the majority of conservation work is working with people. A lot of scientists also think that this is actually taking money away from conservation and that this money would be better spent towards living species that need our help. I actually don't know if I agree with this because I think that the type of people that are likely to give money to a company that is trying to resurrect the woolly mammoth, I don't know if conservation is on their agenda. I don't honestly see the people donating to conservation projects and the people donating to resurrect the woolly mammoth as the same person. I think they're two different types of groups of people. I actually think that something like this, though, if done properly, could actually increase money for conservation. Because if somebody gets really excited about the woolly mammoth, this could lend a conversation to the plight of living species like the African and Asian elephant and their conservation struggles. This could potentially take people who are incredibly wealthy, willing to invest in projects like the woolly mammoth, and get them excited, get them interested about saving living species. I think that if done right, you could make this link, you could make this argument, and this could open up more funding toward conservation. But again, it has to be done right. It has to be marketed in a really great way, similar to Colossal is doing with these extinct species. In the Joe Rogan podcast, Ben says, "We actually made the largest investment in marsupial research, more than the Australian government." So if they're giving all this money for marsupial research, then it does make sense that other species will benefit. An argument against doing this is that some scientists fear that if you bring back these extinct species, then the public won't have to worry about extinction, that it's not forever. So you can just always bring species back. It doesn't matter if we decimate a population or a species because we can just use technology or science to bring it back. I'm actually seeing this play out in the US government right now under the Trump administration. Use this as a way to remove funding for endangered species, which desperately need the funding to survive. This statement was released from the Fish and Wildlife Service, saying that it is time to fundamentally change how we think about species conservation. Going forward, we must celebrate removals from the endangered list, not additions. Since the dawn of our nation, it has been innovation, not regulation, that has spawned American greatness. The revival of the dire wolf heralds the advent of a thrilling new era of scientific wonder, showcasing how the concept of de-extinction can serve as a bedrock for modern species conservation. This process is already setting up the stage to cut funding from the Endangered Species Act because we can just rely on innovation. But as I have heavily said in this podcast, so much of endangered species work is about working with people on the ground. Most species are not yet at a point where they're so small where they're going to suffer the effects of inbreeding. Most of these species, they are not yet at numbers low enough that they need this kind of technological advancement to save them. Rather, they need habitat restoration, work on the ground to make sure that people tolerate the species. Most species just need habitat. They need to coexist with people on the landscape. That is the majority of conservation work. I want to know, what do you think? Do you think this is a dire wolf? Do you think that we should try de-extinction for species? Which species would you consider? This is a really cool topic, and I would love to hear from you. I really hope you're enjoying this podcast episode. I hope I was able to cover all of the angles. If there's something you would like me to cover, please let me know, and I will do more podcasts on this subject or subjects similar to it. As I mentioned in the video, I studied African forest elephants. To learn more about what I did during my PhD, check out this video.